supposed to send this to somebody.
Good evening and greetings welcome on behalf of the Johnston County Heritage Commission Black History Committee. I am Pearl Blackman. I extend a special thank you to our moderator, Dr. Twala Wells, panelists, and Centenary United Methodist Church for allowing us to grace this beautiful sanctuary with our presence. I would also like to thank Denise Bennett, our program chair, for her excellence in planning. Reexamining Racism is a continuing series of discussions sponsored by the Black History Committee looking at systemic racism in Johnston County. Our first series was the Fight to Vote. Our second, the Right to Live, Racism in Healthcare. Tonight is our third series, The Right to Breathe, Racism in Criminal Justice. Our fourth series will be held October 8th, and we invite you to join us for The Right to Learn, Systemic Racism in Education. We will have remarks at this time from our program chair, Denise Bennett. Denise.
Little did I know when I presented this program idea to the Black History Committee back in October that we were going to be experiencing so many things in 2020. It's been said that the unexamined life is not worth living. So we decided to examine racism in our county. And we've seen that just like around the country, that it does exist here. But we're hoping that through these discussions, we'll be able to open people's minds so that in other avenues, we can sit down together and to work out solutions. We're very glad you're here with us tonight. And we hope that through these discussions, that we can, as Americans, as North Carolinians, and as Johnstonians, we can move toward that more perfect union. So Todd Johnston now is going to come to give us a historical perspective of racism in the criminal justice system in Johnston County. Todd.
Poverty is not a crime. Color is not a crime. However, poor people, especially people of color, are criminalized in our society, in essence, for being poor. Many are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes and are unable to vote, get jobs, and support their families. Their children suffer and get caught up in a vicious cycle of poverty and entanglement in the criminal justice system. Many end up in prison or jail by the time they finish high school, that is, if they finish high school. America is supposed to be a land of freedom and opportunity. So how can this be? Someone accused of a crime is supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So how is it that Ronnie Long of Concord, North Carolina, and Charles Finch of nearby Wilson County, both black men, each ended up in prison for over 40 years for capital crimes when evidence failed to prove their guilt? How is it that unarmed black men have died at the hands of law enforcement officers? As Mr. Long stated just days ago when interviewed by a reporter, black men been having knees on their necks ever since they set foot in the Western Hemisphere, he says. George Floyd ain't the first. He ain't the second. He ain't the third. He ain't the last. And that was quoted in the Charlotte Observer just 2 days ago. Again, in our land of freedom and opportunity, how can this be? A unique memorial was unveiled in Montgomery, Alabama in 2018. It's called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and it names thousands of lynching victims, including several here in Johnston County, North Carolina. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 4,400 lynchings of African Americans across 20 states between the Civil War and World War II. Racial terror lynchings were more than just hangings, the EJI states. They involved groups of white people committing acts of fatal violence against African Americans to instill fear in the entire black community. These lynchings were frequently carried out in broad daylight, and perpetrators could expect impunity. Government officials frequently turned a blind eye or condoned the mob violence. This era of what racial terrorism shaped the geographic, social, and economic conditions of African Americans and America as a whole in ways that are still evident today. And that ends the quote. Thankfully, there is one name that is missing from the monument in Alabama. It's Thomas Smith, who came close to being the victim of a Johnston County lynch mob more than once while standing trial for murder in 1899-1900. Sheriff Jesse Ellington, a Confederate veteran, was determined that Smith would have his day in court and had the prisoner secretly relocated to Raleigh for safekeeping. Smith was eventually granted a new trial, and his death sentence was commuted by the governor in October of 1900. During the Christmas holiday in 1899, while in a Goldsboro jail, Smith sent a little notepad to Sheriff Ellington as a present with the following message attached. Please accept my many thanks for life in this world. May the God of all the earth keep you and your seed forever and ever. Please accept this little pad and keep it in your pocket in memory of my love for you and your children. It is a covenant showing how I think of you. This is my sacrifice to you. I am better today. Hope you may never die. Your obedient prisoner, Thomas T. Smith. And I decided to actually bring that letter. This is a letter that we have in the collections of the Johnston County Heritage Center, written in Mr. Smith's hand. We have the original letter here. It was written from Goldsboro, dated December the 26th, 1899, while he faced an uncertain future. As it turned out, his death sentence was commuted. Our goal in gathering this esteemed panel tonight is to explore ways of emulating Sheriff Ellington's kind of justice in our county, in our state, and in our nation. So without further ado, I would like to turn the platform over to our moderator, Dr. Twyla Casey Wells.
Thank you, Todd. Welcome everyone to The Right to Breathe, Re-Examining Racism in the Criminal Justice System. I'd like to introduce our panel for this evening. James Chapman is an alumnus of North Carolina State University and received his Juris Doctorate from Campbell University. He has worked as a public defender and a defense attorney at times in various parts of the state of North Carolina. He currently teaches criminal and business law at Wake Technical Community College and previously taught at Campbell University School of Law. He has a wife and 2 children and lives in Raleigh. Dennis Gaddy is the Executive Director of Community Success Initiative, a nonprofit corporation with an emphasis on men and women who are transitioning from prison and jail, or who otherwise find themselves entangled in the criminal justice system. A graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and the Campbell University School of Law, Dennis had a 20-year sales career. However, due to some poor financial decisions, he experienced the pain of bankruptcy, the loss of his law license, and prison. He learned the value of using the past as a place of reference, but not residence, and designed a 15-step leadership course on how to get from where you are to where you want to be. He serves as a member of the North Carolina Lawyers Advocates for Justice, Racial, and Ethnic Bias Task Force and the NAACP National Delegation to the United Nations. He also serves as Criminal Justice Chair for the North Carolina NAACP, and he works with the Center for State Government's National Reentry Resource Center. He was recently recognized with the Goodman Award by Leadership Triangle. Dennis has been married for 30 years and he has 2 daughters. Walter Martin is a private investigator and is owner of Truth Investigations in Princeton. He is a retired law enforcement officer, having served as a patrol officer, detective, detective sergeant, patrol sergeant, master officer, detective lieutenant, and patrol lieutenant. He graduated from Johnston Community College, all right, in the basic law enforcement training program, and in 2001 was awarded the advanced law enforcement certification. He ran unsuccessfully for sheriff of Johnston County in 1990 and in 1999, becoming the first minority elected to serve in Princeton's Town of Commission. He currently serves as mayor pro tem, and he is married and has 1 son. John P., or otherwise known as Jack O'Hale, is a trial defense attorney who routinely argues before the United States District Court and U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit. A graduate of the UNC School of Law, he is regularly listed in Best Lawyers in America for his criminal defense acumen. He also appears frequently in Business North Carolina's Legal Elite, a peer-reviewed group that represents only 3% of North Carolina's lawyers. He is a member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the North Carolina Academy of Trial Lawyers, and is a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Jack is married and has 3 children, and he recently, in 2016, began practicing law with his son, Frank. The Honorable Judge Addie Harris Rawls is a graduate of North Carolina Central University School of Law, is serving her 4th term as an elected North Carolina District Court Judge in Johnston, Harnett, and Lee counties, the 11th District. She presides over civil, criminal, domestic, juvenile, and child support court proceedings. In 1991, she became the first American Assistant District Attorney to be employed in her district, and she became the district's first African-American female judge in 2002. Judge Rawls serves as chairperson of the Juvenile Crime Prevention Council of Johnston County, and she's also a pastor and a well-known keynote and motivational speaker. She is married and has 2 children. We're going to turn our portion over here now and kick off with some questions, and we'll turn to Judge Rawls for the first question. The term Black Lives Matter has become a rallying cry for Americans all across the country. What does that phrase mean to you, and how important is its message?
It's amazing that the term Black Lives Matter is a 3-word term that has caused so much dissension and violence and rejection and in our country. To me, it means that lives of Black people matter. That is not to say that other lives do not matter, but at this point, we're focusing on trying to right what looks like injustice, unfairness, prejudice, and other matters here. I believe, for me, it says to me that something that I've always believed in my life, that my life mattered. And certainly the road to where I am, I can say in the old song, no one told me the road would be easy. I remember starting out in poverty and moving forth to obtain an education, to try to distinguish myself and do the things I needed to do in order to make it. But I also recognize that having considered myself to have made it, I have not really made it until I consider those who have not. So it says to me, Addie, remember where you've come from. And remembering where you've come from, you have to focus on that. I remember distinctly at Wake Forest, where I attended undergraduate, that we would have a group of students eat lunch in a cafeteria. And even in the early 80s, there were discussions of how people felt comfortable about a table where in a university of the stature and size of Wake Forest, we had approximately 125 minority students in the early 80s. And someone would be offended to see a table that had African American students eating together. And they would say, why are you together at that table? I said, just like all the other friends who are seated at tables in this same cafeteria, I'm sitting with my friends. It didn't mean that there were other students of other race who were not my friends. They were my friends too. But I chose to have lunch on that day with some friends of mine. So to me, it is important for us to remind people, certainly that our lives, Black lives matter. I believe all lives matter for that fact. But it's important to remind people that I remember who I am. And remembering who I am does not lessen who you are or say that I will treat you any less. I have friends of all races and ethnicities. However, in the process of doing it, take time to realize that we can no longer say it's other people's problems. It becomes a situation that all of us have to address. So I believe that. I'm concerned with a whole lot of things. As you look at traditionally what happens, where we are now, this is not the education week, but even with the dilemma that COVID-19 has caused us, can we make sure that all children's needs are addressed, and especially those children who have already been disenfranchised, otherwise written off, and certainly have a whole lot to work against to get to where they're going. And I believe that.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, would you also address this question?
Yes, thank you, Twyla. Just want to also put a shout out to those who are working hard every day to gain speech fluency. Whenever I think of Black Lives Matter, that I not only think of those who came before me, those who came with me, but those who are coming behind me. A few months ago, in response to a request from the NAACP that the Princeton Board of Commissioners drafted a resolution. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that this resolution said was that today we speak of those Americans with black and brown skin, remembering that every life matters. So when I hear the terminology that Black Lives Matter, that doesn't mean that white lives don't. That doesn't mean that we're above and everyone else is beneath. But in this particular situation and circumstance, it is the Black lives who have brought forth and issue a concern, a very valid concern that they are afraid of how that they are been treated and the direction that the country is taking and where that they feel left behind. So whenever I think of Black Lives Matter, I automatically say to myself, yes, I know that all lives matter. If I will go to my white neighbor's house and help him just as quickly as I will a black neighbor. But if today that the black neighbor has the problem, that I'm going to go see if I can help that person. And to me, that's what Black Lives Matter means.
Thank you. The second question is, in North Carolina, Black people constitute 23% of state residents, but 48% of people in county jails and 52% of people in state prisons. Studies have shown that Black people are more likely to be stopped by police, detained pre-trial, charged with more serious crimes, and sentenced more harshly than white people. How can these disparities be explained? Mr. Chapman, if you would address this question.
This question is very similar to one that I posit to my students in both my criminology class, where we look at the origins of crime and criminality, and in our introduction to criminal justice. And what I ask them to first consider is, as damning as these statistics are, and I've found similar statistics today when I was looking for the most recent arrest rates for simple possession of marijuana in North Carolina, where statistically, if you're an African American, it is 3.67 times as likely that you'll be arrested for simple possession as if you're white. But I think if we focus just on the arrest, we miss a very valuable step here, and this is one that I point out to my students. Often the systemic problems begin well before the arrest. They begin with the criminalization of the activity. If you look at, for example, the most serious larcenies that occur in the United States, the last statistics I looked at, wage theft, that is employers stealing from their employees, was over $36 billion in a given year, which dwarfs all other larcenies that are committed in the United States. It's about a 20-to-1 ratio to burglary. It's about a 4 or 5-to-1 ratio to other larcenies. And yet, we don't criminalize when the employer steals from the employee because he doesn't pay him his overtime properly, or he doesn't give him his work breaks, or he falsifies returns. That is typically handled in our civil system with rare exceptions. So really the beginning of this discussion is what we criminalize and then how we punish it. And there's where you're going to find the roots of the systemic racism that you see in society. And this is a very old story. I was talking with Todd earlier, and I mentioned I'm an amateur historian, wannabe historian, forced to be a lawyer because that's how liberal arts works. I was mentioning about pig laws, which was the idea after the ending of the American Civil War. There was a necessity for those that wanted to maintain white supremacy to come up with a mechanism, a legal mechanism that was not overtly racist, that was not overtly a reinstitution of slavery, but was a method through which they could then and retain the extraction of free black labor. So what was done was they would criminalize things, and then they would sentence almost exclusively African Americans who had recently been lifted out of slavery, and sadly sometimes they would wind up working back on the same plantations they had worked on as slaves, but this time they were prisoners of the state. And this is an old story that has repeated itself through American history for 100 years since emancipation, and is something we struggle with today. So I choose to focus on and ask my students this question too. don't tell me there is systemic racism, don't tell me there isn't systemic racism. Show me the facts, and then show me your explanation for those facts. If you show me these arrest statistics, if you show me the criminalization of certain behavior and the civil penalties of others, I think those will demonstrate if there's systemic racism, but I'll leave the conclusions to my students because I can lead them to the water, but I can't make them drink it.
Thank you. Mr. Gaddy, if you would address this.
The situation that you were just speaking of regarding once a person has done their time and now they're re-enslaved again because of the laws that have changed. It was called convict leasing. And there's a book that's called Slavery by Another Name. And you need to look at book and read that. So, how can these disparities be explained? There's another book that's really important for you to read on this topic. It's by Michelle Alexander. It's called The New Jim Crow. And what that book talks about, sorry, thank you. And what that book talks about is that in the Jim Crow South, once you were in that system and you were African American or brown, then there were just certain things you were denied. You couldn't vote. You had to drink from a different water fountain. You couldn't stay in the hotels and the highways and byways of America, right? So fast forward to where we are now, is that the new Jim Crow has the same thing if you have a criminal record, right? So you can't vote, you can't do certain things. So that's a very important book, and these disparities can be explained that way, but also they can be displayed by us taking the elephant out of the room. They're racist policies. They're racist policies. They're in the criminal justice system. So yes, in North Carolina, 23% of African Americans are of state residents, but 48% of people in county jails. So, and it's not that white people, that black people are more criminalistic than the white folk. Because statistics say that African Americans and brown and white people commit crimes at about the same rate. But you wouldn't be able to tell that if you walked into any courtroom in America, right? And that's where criminal justice intersects with poverty. Because if you can afford a lawyer, you don't go to jail. How about that, right? So it's not just about because African Americans and white commit crimes at the same rate. But if you got a lawyer, you don't go to jail, right? So and also along this criminal justice continuum, like stated, at every stop, it's upside down, right? From the stop. White folks may get stopped, but African Americans and brown get stopped and frisked. See? You get to the magistrate's office, bond, bail. That's a whole nother issue that we are wrestling with right now. Is that if you can't afford a bond, just say it's a $3,000 bond, but you don't have $300. Poverty again. Then you stay in jail for a week, 10 days till your trial come up, then you've lost your job. All right? So we're working with a fund out of Durham called the Bail Fund of Durham, and we're having, it's a nonprofit concern that we are the fiscal agents for at CSI. By the way, shout out to CSI and the Second Chance Alliance. And we're raising money through funding to be able to pay those $2,000 bonds and $3,000 bonds, so that when they go to court, which 97% of people come to court, we get the money back and we just recycle it. Because they got to give it back to you if you pay cash. I'll give it to somebody, all right? So anyway, so those are some of how I see the disparities being explained. And then if I could add a question to that question would be, how can these disparities be solved, be dealt with? Policy. We're a member of the Second Chance Alliance, and 80% of our work is getting policy change. We just had Governor Cooper sign our Second Chance Act in June, which expands expungements for people, right? so they can get their life back on track for a second chance.
Thank you. Mr. Hale.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's an interesting question, and I noticed that the question speaks about North Carolina statistics, but we're talking about Johnston County. I've been in Johnston County since 1976. You know, when I moved here, there were only 61,000 people in the county. There was one sheriff and 12 deputies. The Smithville Police Department, which my friend Walter Martin worked for basically his entire law enforcement career, was much smaller than it is now. But what I've learned through the years, because I've served both as a prosecutor and a defense counsel, is the mechanism that results in people being detained pre-trial, being charged with more serious crimes, sentenced more harshly, is based upon several factors, first of which is poverty. And poverty, in large part, stems from lack of education and good jobs. You know, the way the bail system is set up, if you ever take the time to read the North Carolina General Statutes, a magistrate or a judge is supposed to go down a litany of possible bail conditions, starting with an unsecured bond. You can just sign yourself out and go home.
That's right.
And you can be placed in the custody of a parent or a responsible adult. As a last resort, a judge is supposed to impose a secured bond, but that's not the way the system really works. The system works because the prosecutors and the judges make a bail recommendation list, and those people who are poor, who don't have jobs, who don't have education, as my friend who just spoke said, don't have the financial wherewithal to be released. Now, we've seen something happen very interesting during the pandemic. All of a sudden, the custodian of the jail and law enforcement realized we can't be locking all these people up in a confined condition during this pandemic, so we're going to basically just release everybody on their own signature. And you know what? That system is working. People still come to court. People who don't have money cannot hire good lawyers. And to tell you the truth, although the United States Supreme Court says that every person is entitled to an attorney, it doesn't say you're entitled to a really fine attorney. And what has happened in this country is our legislature has vastly underfunded representation for the poor and for the indigent. Everybody's supposed to be equal before the law, equal under the law. That's our Judeo-Christian ethic. It's enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. It's the principle of our United States Constitution. But you know, those words mean nothing unless the people make them live. And the way we make them live is to go to our legislature and say, adequately fund our courts, adequately fund people who we want to represent, the indigents, and pay them, because to be candid with you, an attorney who does 2 or 3 speeding tickets in a day will make more profit than someone who's representing an indigent on a very serious felony charge. So consequently, people who are without financial resources, be they black or Hispanic or white and poor, they're in a very, very perilous position because they cannot get out of jail because they don't have the financial resources to do so. And the time comes after they've languished in a cell long enough, maybe the court-appointed lawyer shows up and says, look, I got a deal for you. If you plead to this felony, they'll let you out on probation. Well, after being in jail, losing a job, being there for weeks, people say, I'll plead to anything to get out of jail.
That's right.
The problem with that is all of us know in today's world, when you have a felony conviction, that's a career ender. You lose valuable civil rights. You lose your right to vote, obtain a passport, forever possess a firearm. And it has drastic collateral consequences on your educational and employment prospects. So this is a vicious cycle. By charging people and forcing people into this predicament, we just put people back in the continuous cycle of no education, poverty, and eventually people build a criminal record because they continued to be arrested and be thrown into jail. and they end up where their careers, their job prospects are ruined. And the only employment you can have then, corporate America is not going to hire you. The HR departments won't vet it. Your insurance carriers won't let corporate America hire these people. People have to become self-employed mechanics, carpenters, what have you. So that's the vicious circle. And one of the things I would very much like to see happen is not only our public defenders be adequately funded, but our judges. We don't pay our judges enough. And if you want to have the brightest and the best take the bench, and we are very fortunate in Johnston County to have good judges. I've known Addie Harris Ross since she was a fiery prosecutor. She represented the state vigorously and ethically. And she's been one heck of a fine judge. But the system only works when people give life to the words of the Constitution. Now, you know we don't have a system of justice in this country. It doesn't exist. We have a system of justice under the law, and there's a big difference there. Justice is perfect. The law can only be careful.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. O'Hill. We're going to turn our attention now to question number 3. Some say police killings of unarmed African Americans are isolated incidents or the result of a few bad apples. Others say this is a sign of broader problems in the treatment of minorities by law enforcement. The traditional training of law enforcement has been that of warriors who conquer and control. There's been some debate as to whether training should focus more on officers being trained as guardians who serve and protect. On which side of that debate would you fall, guardian versus warrior, and why? Mr. Chapman?
Again, it's a question we address in the class. And one of the things, one of the classes we work on is about serial killers, believe it or not. And we talk about the particular difficulty the police can face when they essentially adopt the warrior cop mentality. Now, this is a nation in many ways that's made by wars. If you look at our statues, if you look at our heroes, they're in uniform. We can't kid ourselves that we are a fundamentally peaceful people. Now, you can say that we're driven to war, but we're a warlike people as well. We venerate warriors, so I don't think it's a surprise that we often couch our language of law enforcement in the warrior cop or the versus what's sometimes I think disparagingly called a softer approach. But when you look at the success rates of those police departments in the United States and particularly overseas that practice that softer approach, if you look at systems like Norway or if you look at systems like Portugal, and you compare police departments that have bad reputations for their behavior historically, and you look at their success rates in solving crime, you're going to find that they're low. Because an occupying army is just that. It's an occupying army. It's not a police force. And soldiers are soldiers. They're not cops. And when you turn your cops into soldiers, when you turn them into warriors, yes, you can maintain a degree of order, but you can't maintain justice. What you will wind up with is an occupation. The example I like to cite, and it's slightly off topic to this, is there was a serial killer operating in Indianapolis called BTK. And he was preying upon gay men in the city. But the Indianapolis Police Department had such a poor relationship with the gay community in Indianapolis. They would raid their nightclubs, they would break up their meetings, they would harass them. Then when it came to investigating this killer, they were blocked at many avenues because they could not get the support of the population to give them the information to solve the crime. And this situation is repeated over and over again in our communities of color, in those communities of immigrants in this country, both lawful and unlawful immigrants, registered and non-registered aliens. If it becomes an us versus them mentality with the population, you will not have effective law enforcement. So if you ask where I fall, guardian versus warrior, I would say I would fall on the guardian side there. But more than that, I would fall on the side of the idealized version of the police officer that I probably naively grew up with in the 1960s, where he was your friend, where he was someone you could turn to without the consequence necessarily of arrest and without the consequence of ostracism, I think, that we see today. So I'll leave it at that and say that we do have a long way to go. I do think that law enforcement is starting to address this. I think there has been a recognition of the failure of the warrior cop model, and the idea that a return to more of the community policing model that I think suffered after the 9/11 events might be something on our horizon.
Thank you. Mr. O'Hale?
I'll speak quickly and shortly this time. I got to tell you, after 45 years of practicing law, I represent a lot of police officers. A lot of police officers are my friends. And I will tell you that most folks who go into law enforcement, in my humble judgment, go in to protect and to serve. My good friend Walter Martin over here is a terrific example of that. Walter was a wonderful police officer. I never once heard him raise his voice to anyone. He was conscientious, he was professional, and that's what most police officers are. Now, there's bad apples on every barrel, bad lawyers, judges, doctors, preachers, and police officers, and it cuts across the social spectrum. What I think is frustrating about law enforcement is we don't pay our law enforcement officers a lot of money, and once people get married and have children, if you want to have the brightest and the best, you have to retain and keep the brightest and the best, and one of the ways you do that is you give them great training and you pay them with what they're worth. And I think we as a society have fallen short in that regard. You know, when I started practicing law, you went to join the North Carolina Highway Patrol. It was a $2,500 person waiting list back in 1975. Now they're begging for recruits. Nobody wants to be part of the organization. And that's a function of lack of leadership, lack of pay, terrible morale. We have got to have top flight law enforcement officers, and most of them are great people who just do that, protect and serve. And I thank you for your service, Walter.
Thank you, thank you.
Mr. Martin, if you would.
No, whenever I'm sitting and listening, that I'm thinking that one of the things that is really missing from this conversation is the regular citizens. The idea of police being this warrior, that is not something that I'm familiar with. My training and most of the training I've seen is geared towards serving and protecting. A few days ago, the news cycle covered a story where that President Trump asked General John Kelly, why do people give their lives as soldiers? And so you have to ask the same question about the person that engages in law enforcement. It is our hope that this person gets into law enforcement because he cares about the community. That was my entire focus during my career, that I did everything that I did to protect my community, because there are people that are out there on our streets right this minute that do not belong out there, that there are people who are going to commit crimes. They are going to hurt people. So there has to be a means of dealing with these people. Now, but whenever you get into the figures as to what happens and how often this segment of the people are charged, and once they go into the system, what happens to them, that is where you get away from where that you can justify what happens to that person. That Jack O'Hale and I do not agree often, but whenever he was telling you about how it is whenever you are charged and get locked up, that should be a crime. That I've seen person after person, and they may have been guilty of what they were charged with, but how did you get from point A to point B is a disgrace. A person who has the means, they are a whole lot better off than a person who is poor. And that's the imperfect system that we work in, and lives are being devastated because of this system.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Before we turn our discussion towards solutions, I'd like to invite our audience to post any questions they may have on our Facebook Live, and we'll turn our attention and answer those as we finish up our session here tonight. So our last question, and just again, we're about 10 till, so we've have about 5 minutes for everybody maybe to collectively discuss this last question. Research has indicated that unconscious racial bias often affects human behavior. What can the criminal justice system do in terms of training and education to cultivate an internal culture to combat the effect of unconscious racial bias? Mr. O'Hale?
Yeah, we live in a pluralistic society, and it's a function of all of us, not the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system can't solve this problem. People have got to solve this problem. We've all got together and understand and recognize that everybody has different opinions. People have different colors of their skin. They have different lifestyles. But the fact of the matter is, under our system of law and our Constitution, people have a right to live in a free and open society. We should respect one another. We should have dialogue with one another. We should communicate with one another. And people who are seriously interested in changing our criminal justice system should lobby the local district attorney and the local courts to do away with our bail system, and to just recognize that most people are going to show up in court. They live here, they work here, they're not going anywhere. And even in Wake County, which I detest going to court up there, they have a system where they screen people who are brought into the criminal justice system, and a whole host of people are released on their own recognizance. That's what's going to bring people together when we communicate with one another, respect one another's opinion. And I think being in a community like this, we have a much better chance of accomplishing that than to be a huge metropolitan community when people don't know one another. Thank you.
Mr. Martin.
Yes, most police departments are governed at the local level. So it is incumbent upon the citizens to find out where your local representative stands on these matters. Because really, if there's going to be any change at all, that I believe in this area, that most of it will be done on the local level.
Thank you. Mr. Gaddy.
Yes, so when I think about the word racism or racist, most people, yes, they just figure that that's, prejudice, whatever. But there's a lot of more depth of teaching around that word, because really at the core of it, being a racist is being able to take advantage of being white, right? And if you do that, you sometimes run into unconscious bias because you don't think you're conscious, like Some white people say, you know, some of my best friends are black. Well, I mean, what's that supposed to mean, right? So I'm thinking there's this class called the Racial Equity Workshop. I've taken it 5 times. And what it does, it brings people into a room with trainers on giving the facts of what's happened since 1605 up to now when it comes to racial conflict and race. So every time I take it, I learn something else. So I would recommend that at the, I mean, whether it's the criminal justice level or whether it's the local level, whether it's the church, yes, the church, that you come together and learn about racial equity, right? Short story. So when FDR signed into law the Social Security Act of 1935, right, it included everybody except agriculture and domestics, right? So my daddy was a farmer, my mama was a maid. So they didn't have the right to even take advantage of Social Security until later on, which it was already skewed this way toward people who were able to start Social Security earlier. Fast forward today, my daddy's 90 years old, my mama's 86. Because they were late in getting started and getting their Social Security, guess who has to supplement their retirement? Their children, right? But had we had the same footing when things got started in 1935, I probably wouldn't have to worry about that, right? So that's an example of how the history, and it's all systemic. It's like by design, right? So having those workshops and classes will be very educational and I think needful.
Thank you. Mr. Chapman.
I read this question, and you know, I've been in education now for more than 25 years, and what I've seen happen is a narrowing of the focus of our education, of our police officers and our criminal justice majors. And I think if we open it back up, if we look at that word training and education, I think it's the open mind that functions that can challenge ideas like racism and unconscious bias. I think as silly as this might sound, I think it's reading books like The Diary of Anne Frank. I think it's reading books like Black Like Me. I think it's seeing plays. I think it's a liberal arts education. I think it's experiencing the world that opens your eyes. I think if you're so narrowly focused in your education, your training on just the bare facts of what you do, you'll miss the bigger world. You'll miss the unconscious racism that permeates it. So my solution in my small corner of the world would be to have my students take English courses and take literature courses and to read works that would expose them to different communities and different people at different times so that they could begin to develop an appreciation of their privilege if they're white or the system in general.
Thank you. Judge Rawls.
We have to become more intentional in our actions and the way we interact and do things. I believe that if it's going to work, we need the training and education of our law enforcement, and I believe we need to still work on the training and education of our young people and engaging and involving them. And I'll join Mr. Gaddy in his one remark that one of my best avenues is through the church. That's what I believe in. That some of those Sunday mornings, instead of hearing their pastor preach, maybe I need to have the youth in the back building with law enforcement, let them engage, let them know each other and become into a relationship. That's what we're lacking today. Everybody wants to go home to their ivory towers and mind their own business. But at this point, we're going to have to do more than that. We're going to have to put demands on those of us who are elected. We have to place demands upon our local governments and our law enforcement agencies and say we need to be engaged in intentional conversation. I've learned now that we don't talk a lot about, the word is inclusiveness. That's the word my son has taught me and told me, Mom, quit talking about we want racial equities, et cetera. We need to talk more about being included. And inclusiveness takes that education part where we teach people what, I remember when I first came to work in the DA's office, a very, very, very dear friend of mine looked at me and she said to me, I'm glad that we have colored people working here. I looked at her and said, we're friends. We don't use that word. She says, well, I think it would be an insult to call you black. I said, no, you can call me black. I said, it is, but that person to this day is a friend of mine because I took the time to say, that's not what you do. She never had an interaction before. I was the first one working in that office. So if we start having those conversations, if we start talking to our young people and telling them how they should react, how to be conscious of where they are. Used to be, for years, I visited a lot of schools, talking in classes to young people and talking to them about decisions and choices. And my thing to them is, I'm here today as your friend. When you see me in the court on the bench, I'm gonna act like I don't know you. Because I've already warned you. And even as young folk, to make them comfortable with their lives, who they are, and have them prepared to do what they need to do. And the same thing with law enforcement. I'm grateful that it used to be, we talked about law enforcement officers who worked part-time jobs at skating rinks and places like that, or the officers in the schools, some folks, so we don't like that image, but they create relationships. And in creating those relationships, then maybe we can avoid some things that will happen in the past, in the future, that would make them think that they're more foes because these law enforcement officers, the warrior, I think Martin said he didn't know the word warrior, that's the Rambos. They're not walking around like Rambos, they're more human, and people receive them more as humans. So I say that, I've been quiet most of the night, so I need to say that education is key. Being in a relationship, authentic relationship, is more key, and being able to converse about it and talk about it.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, panelists, for a very interesting evening. Did we have any questions from our audience? All right. Well, we'll invite Ms. Denise back up.
Well, we want to thank our distinguished panelists for this wonderful discussion tonight. We also want to thank Centenary United Methodist Church for allowing us to have our session here. We also want to thank Dr. Wells, our wonderful moderator, as well as the audience. Please do join us on October 8th for our final presentation. Well, it'll be final for this year, for our final presentation where we re-examine racism in education. Thank you all so much, and we will continue this discussion. Good night.
John P. Okay.
Before y'all move, can we get a